The last day of death row inmate Velma Barfield, the grandma who became a serial killer. On November 2nd, 1984, inside Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, a quiet 52-year-old grandmother prepared to die. Her name was Velma Barfield. To many people, she didn't look like a killer. She was soft-spoken, deeply religious, and known on death row as someone who prayed with other inmates and comforted the guards who watched over her. But behind that calm appearance was a far darker story. Velma Barfield had spent years hiding a deadly secret. One victim after another had fallen mysteriously ill around her. Family members, patients she cared for, and finally her fiancé, Stuart Taylor. When investigators discovered arsenic in his body, the truth began to surface. What seemed like natural deaths were anything but. By the time her crimes were uncovered, Velma had become one of the most unusual figures ever sent to death row. A grandmother, a caregiver, and a serial poisoner whose final 24 hours would make history in America. Long before the world would know her as the woman executed in North Carolina's death chamber, Velma Barfield was simply Margie Velma Bullard, a quiet girl growing up in rural South Carolina during the 1930s. Born in 1932 during the hardships of the Great Depression, Velma's childhood was shaped by poverty, strict discipline, and deeply traditional values. Her father was known to be harsh and controlling, while her mother tried to keep the household together under constant tension. Neighbors remembered Velma as shy and polite. She attended church regularly and appeared to follow the path expected of a Southern girl in that era. At just 17 years old, she married Thomas Burke, hoping that marriage would give her the stability she lacked growing up. Together, they moved to North Carolina, raised 2 children, Ronnie and Pam, and tried to build a quiet family life. But behind that modest life, trouble was slowly building. Thomas struggled with alcohol, and arguments inside the home became more frequent. Velma herself began to suffer from serious health problems, particularly chronic back pain. Doctors prescribed her strong medications, painkillers and sedatives that were common treatments at the time, but highly addictive. Over the years, Velma's dependence on those medications grew steadily. By the early 1960s, addiction had taken hold. In 1969, tragedy struck when a fire destroyed the family home. Inside that house was Thomas Burke, Velma's husband, who died in the blaze. At the time, the fire was ruled accidental. Authorities believed a cigarette had ignited the flames. No criminal investigation followed. But years later, when Velma's crimes finally came to light, investigators would revisit that fire with a very different perspective. After her husband's death, Velma tried to rebuild her life. She worked various small jobs and eventually married again, this time to a man named Jennings Barfield. That marriage did not last long. Within a year, Jennings died suddenly of what appeared to be heart complications. Once again, there was no immediate suspicion. 2 husbands dead. Both deaths explained away by circumstances that seemed unfortunate but not criminal. Velma continued her life, now working as a caregiver and housekeeper for elderly residents in her community. She appeared trustworthy and kind. Families welcomed her into their homes. She cooked meals, cleaned houses, and helped care for people who were often frail and dependent. It was the perfect cover, because by the early 1970s, Velma's addiction had worsened. Prescription drugs were expensive, and she frequently found herself drowning in debt. When money ran short, Velma began writing bad checks and stealing small amounts from the people who trusted her. At first, these acts were relatively minor, but Velma soon discovered something that would change everything: arsenic. At the time, arsenic could be easily obtained in certain pesticides and rat poisons. When added in small amounts to food or drink, it produced symptoms that resembled natural illness: vomiting, weakness, stomach pain. In elderly or already sick victims, those symptoms often appeared indistinguishable from common disease. Velma realized something terrifying: poison could solve problems quietly. Her first confirmed victim was her own mother, Lillian Bullard. In 1974, Velma had moved back into her mother's home. Lillian began suffering from strange bouts of sickness, severe stomach pains, and weakness that doctors struggled to explain. She eventually died after a long decline. At the time, the death was attributed to natural causes. Years later, investigators would determine that Velma had poisoned her mother with arsenic. But the pattern did not stop there. Velma's work as a caregiver placed her in close proximity to vulnerable people. Several elderly individuals under her care began falling mysteriously ill. Their symptoms followed a similar pattern: nausea, weakness, sudden deterioration. In several cases, the deaths were written off as complications from age or existing illness. Behind the scenes, Velma was quietly feeding them poison. Authorities would eventually link multiple suspicious deaths to her: patients she cared for, family members, and finally the man whose death would unravel everything. His name was Stuart Taylor. By the late 1970s, Velma had become engaged to Taylor, a widowed man who trusted her deeply. But Velma had once again fallen into financial trouble. She had forged checks in Taylor's name and feared he might discover what she had done. The solution she chose was chillingly familiar. In 1978, Velma served Stuart Taylor a beer laced with arsenic. Over the following days, he became violently ill. Doctors initially believed he was suffering from severe stomach flu or food poisoning. But as his condition worsened, suspicions began to grow. Taylor's family insisted on further testing. Laboratory results revealed something shocking: extremely high levels of arsenic in his body. Suddenly, investigators began looking at Velma Barfield more closely. When authorities searched her belongings, they discovered arsenic compounds in her home. They also found forged checks written in the names of several victims. As the investigation expanded, detectives began reopening old deaths connected to Velma, including her mother's and possibly those of her former husbands. The quiet caregiver from North Carolina was suddenly at the center of a murder investigation. Velma was arrested in 1978. During questioning, she eventually confessed to several poisonings. She admitted killing Stuart Taylor and her mother, explaining that she had been desperate for money and overwhelmed by addiction to prescription drugs. The full scope of her crimes was horrifying. What appeared at first to be isolated incidents had actually been part of a years-long pattern of poisoning. Victims who trusted Velma completely, never realizing that their meals or drinks carried deadly doses of arsenic. Her trial began in 1978. Prosecutors presented evidence of Taylor's poisoning, the forged checks, and Velma's confession. Medical experts explained how arsenic works inside the body and how the symptoms matched those experienced by the victims. Velma's defense team did not deny the crimes. Instead, they focused on her drug addiction and emotional instability, arguing that years of prescription drug abuse had clouded her judgment. But the jury was not persuaded. In November 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of first-degree murder for the poisoning of Stuart Taylor. The sentence was death. She became the first woman sentenced to death in North Carolina under the state's modern death penalty laws. Over the next 6 years, Velma remained on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. During that time, something about her behavior began to attract attention. She claimed to have experienced a religious conversion. Velma embraced Christianity deeply while incarcerated. She read the Bible constantly, prayed with other inmates, and corresponded with ministers across the country. Several prison guards and chaplains later said she appeared genuinely remorseful and spent much of her time counseling fellow prisoners. Her supporters argued that she had transformed completely. Letters poured in from religious leaders, prison staff, and even people who had once supported her execution. They described Velma as compassionate, calm, and sincere in her repentance. Her lawyers used this transformation as the basis for repeated appeals and clemency requests. They argued that Velma Barfield was no longer the same person who had committed those crimes years earlier. But the courts rejected those arguments. Each appeal failed. Each request for clemency was denied. By the fall of 1984, Velma Barfield had exhausted every legal option available to her. Her execution date was set for November 2nd. At the time, her case drew national attention. The United States had not executed a woman since 1962, and Velma's story, part quiet grandmother, part serial poisoner, captured public fascination. Supporters called for mercy, pointing to her religious conversion. Others argued that the crimes were too severe to forgive. The debate continued until the very final hours of her life. And as midnight approached inside Central Prison, the quiet grandmother from South Carolina prepared to become the first woman executed in the United States in more than 2 decades.